welcome to Christ for Life. Dr. Van Gilder, thank you so much for joining us in this discussion about how to reach millennials and keep them in the church. So I want to say thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here again.
I want to open up with some Barna research. Barna does a lot of research on the church and church life and culture. And I want to read a couple of statistics. Of those millennials that remain active in the church, 46% say that they learned about how Christians can positively contribute to society, 46%. But of those who dropped out, only 20% learned how they can, as a Christian, positively contribute to society. And then the second stat, and then I'm going to open up for discussion, is 45% of millennials that remain active in the church say that they better understood their purpose in life through the church, whereas only 12% of those who dropped out of church among the millennials learned how to better understand their purpose in life through the church. So that's a significant difference, especially the 45% versus the 12%. So any thoughts on that as we jump into this conversation, how to reach the millennials?
Well, I think one, the suggestion from their data is to teach cultural discernment. And so I think that cultural discernment extends beyond just the culture at large and extends inward to the church culture and possibly its subcultures. If you take that 45%, we're just barely hitting 50% effectiveness at large in the church at large in America. And so why is that? Well, one of the things that they emphasized was that young people, in particular millennials in the data, they don't want their faith to be relegated to Sunday worship. They want it to be holistic and meaningful and full-orbed. And I think as I was pondering this, culture, whatever culture you're talking about, or subculture, has a foundation. And these cultures interact in complicated ways. And so there's a secular culture that the church is situated in. The church has its own culture and multiple flavors of that culture and I think that this dynamic presents a daunting challenge to any church that's missional. I think, the framework of faith from a biblical standpoint is supposed to be evidence-based trust. But the perception of faith, and even the way it's defined, is belief in spite of evidence. And we could complain about that, or we could take responsibility for the perception having some measure of reality, because perception is reality, out there. And so knowing that there's the larger culture has this view that's contrary to our own statements. Now, inside the church, do people believe in spite of evidence? Some do. Do other people have evidence-based trust? Absolutely. We have a mixed bag, which is why we have such mixed results. I think another thing too is foundationally, we're talking about absolute truth.
Right.
And the world that's dead on arrival out in the main culture. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't compute. I think we have a culture that rests on a set of propositions. Hopefully it's more than propositions, but it certainly has a set of propositions that are just foreign to the modern mindset, the secular mindset. And so I think that in teaching cultural discernment to folks inside of the church, and I wouldn't limit it to millennials or young people. I think the whole church probably needs to have an aha moment about here's what our culture is, and here's how well or not well we are acting it out. We can state all we want, here's our culture. And we could try to couch that in terms of, say, our mission. Does our culture support the mission is it contrary to the mission in any ways? Because everybody notices that. Young people notice when there's a disconnect, and disconnects breed mistrust, and mistrust will not generate commitment.
Mhm.
And so I think, Paul had it easy on Mars Hill because he was talking to people who already accepted that there's such a thing as gods. We don't have that today. So I think we have a steeper hill to climb in the modern era compared to Paul, just in cultural discernment, because it's become, I guess, the proliferation of culture, you can say the word right, has really probably is on the heels of the proliferation of knowledge.
So to kind of use an analogy, that is, because you point out something very good. So when Paul is there in Athens, he's dealing with people who generally believe there's a God or multiple gods in their case, right? They even have an altar to an unnamed God, an unknown God. He talks about that. So so he's dealing with people who believe in the supernatural, so to speak. That's a lot easier than trying to get somebody to even believe in believe in God if they don't even believe in the supernatural. And so an analogy would be, you pull out an ad for a car and you sit down with let's say a teenager and say, hey, which car do you want to buy? And they start talking about the features. It's easier to get someone to buy a car if they believe they need a car. But if the conversation starts with the person saying, no, I actually just want to walk, it's hard to get someone to buy a car if they don't believe that they should have a car. And so today we have people who don't believe the equivalent here we're talking about is, hey, they don't believe there's a God. Right. They don't believe there's a God. So hard to get someone to believe in a God, which is the one true God, when they don't even believe in a God in their own mind. They might, deep in their heart, they might have some spiritual belief, which most people do. But that's a challenge in our day. And they can go online and find an entire community of people who don't believe in any God, which solidifies, reinforces, entrenches that belief that there's no God. And it's in that context that the church is trying to reach its own children, right? The millennials, in that context, where they're looking at us saying, I have a whole community around the world that doesn't believe a single thing you're saying, church.
And they're doing just fine.
That's right.
Why do I need that car? I think another thing, there's a subtlety that's easy to miss in the account with Paul, because he, in one paragraph, just a few verses, he goes from explaining how he studied closely the culture. He didn't just walk into Mars Hill the moment he got to Athens. He was there for a couple of weeks. He was studying their culture. That's a very thoughtful thing to do, and an essential thing to do is really understand the culture, not understand all your objections to it, but actually be a responsible skeptic and study the culture well. What am I actually looking at? And understand its framework. And so one of those things would be recognizing, look, around the kitchen table and at the church potluck, we can talk about absolute truth night and day. And it makes perfect sense. We don't even have to question it. We probably should, to be Berean about it. Not to discount it, but to just be responsible with the knowledge. But then he found that entry point. We share a common general concept. We accept that there is such a thing as God or gods. So they had that. There was a common point. And says, all right, here's where I'm going to build a bridge to the gospel. Mm-hmm. Now, he immediately said, concerning the unknown God, you're ignorant. That wouldn't work so well today. But that's right. In that culture, the Greeks, they loved knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so the challenge, it was on for them, and that wasn't inappropriate in that context, at that time, with those people, in that venue.
Hmm.
But if I walk into Starbucks and say, yeah, you're ignorant, well, conversation over.
Yeah,
So,
that's right. That's right. And so what you mentioned there is very important. The church has to be able to study the culture and not just point a finger at the culture, but to actually study it. And that leads, and I want to go back then. So that's point number one, back to something that you alluded to at the very beginning. And that was, you were alluding to this, and that is the talk we talk, we better walk that. We better walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And so I can only imagine if Paul had gone into Mars Hill and he starts speaking about God and the gospel, if they looked at him and say, hey, aren't you that guy that was at the bar last night singing sailor drinking songs? They
yeah,
probably wouldn't have listened to his calling them to righteousness. Right? They probably would have said, no, you're saying this, but last night, you're at the bar, you know? And in many ways, not only do we have to study the culture, we have to talk the talk and walk the walk as well. And I think there's a big challenge there because millennials are very, very, they tend to be very open about their feelings. And if they're feeling like someone's being a hypocrite, they really sense that hypocrisy in other people. And they're not afraid to say, at least in their own heart, I'm not going to follow you.
right, right. They want the they want clarity. In fact, that data specifically used the word clarity, and clarity is one of a number of things that breeds trust. And in fact, there's a book called The Trust Edge that a guy named David Horsiger wrote, and he studied all sorts of international billion-dollar companies, what made them successful, and it was trust, employees trust, consumer trust, and he came up with these 8 pillars of trust, and they're all C words: clarity, compassion, character, commitment, connection, and so consistency. And I think that anybody uh, could adopt these things, but clarity, just if something's clear and understandable, I'm going to trust it. So if there's a clear connection between the church culture and the church's mission, between the pastor's preaching and the pastor's walking, and everyone else, the worship team, everyone around me, if those disconnects, an over politicized church culture is a total disconnect. The gospel isn't political. We're situated in a world that's political, and we got to deal with that. But what about the mission of a church is political in nature? It shouldn't be. And the talk, and it doesn't, one word, the book of James, the tongue one word can just do what you were describing, where like, I'm not following that. Click, they said, whatever, and I think there's trigger words. Almost any political word's going to deliver that quickly in a conversation. And there's other issues that will do that if they're off mission. And if I could, what's the one thing that would keep Christians on mission? I would say probably having a lifestyle of worship, which is easier to say than do, but it's systemically, you could try to memorize the mission and try to make checklists for all the things I'm going to do and not do, and you'll fail. Mm-hmm. That's righteousness, you trying to be righteous on your own merit. But if there's a lifestyle of worship, then you will be missional, and it'll be clear.
So we can leave folks today, and I want to have time for this. The fourth point is we've talked about, for reaching millennials, we need the church and individuals in the church, because the people are the church. We need to have understanding. We need to understand the culture in which we're trying to share the gospel. Okay, there needs to be authenticity, right? Your walk needs to really be your walk. It has to be an authentic walk without hypocrisy. So there's that authenticity, and then there's the clarity. be clear about what God's standard is. Be clear about our being able to communicate the gospel, share it clearly, and let people know exactly what it is, but also have clear lines of communication back and forth, so it's a dialogue. So we have the clarity. And then we have the worship. The fourth point is the worship. And just give you, and worship is what you're saying, really, you're saying that worship is really a lifestyle. It's not just, hey, I'm going to go and sing songs for 30 minutes on a Sunday morning, right? My worship is every day. And when we see that worship, we should affirm that worship. We should be encouraging it. I'll give you a quick example, and I want you to wrap everything up with that in mind. And so we had the understanding, we have the authenticity, we had the clarity, we had the worship. And literally just before we started this call, my oldest daughter, who's going to college in the fall, so she's 17, was on a 4-way Zoom call with 3 of her roommates that they're going to be starting college with. They're going to a Christian college. And so I'm having lunch and I'm listening to their conversation, and they're doing a devotional. So they've never met, they don't know each other than, they signed up, but they're all going to be suite mates at this Christian university. They're doing an online study of the book of Ruth, and the conversation was dwelling on the cultural. This is what they were talking about, and this was really fascinating. I'm eating my Chick-fil-A sandwich, and I'm listening in, as a dad, listening to my 17-year-old daughter with 3 other 17-year-old girls. This is what they were talking about. What were the spiritual and cultural points of significance of Boaz and the kinsman redeemer exchanging the sandal? What was that cultural significance? What did that really mean in that culture? And what's the spiritual significance in the book of Ruth with the sandal by the kinsman redeemer, that whole scene with Boaz and the kinsman redeemer? I'm thinking that's a really great conversation.
Yeah.
And these are 4 millennials, right? So that's the audience we're trying to reach right now in these conversations in this series on Reach Millennials. And so there's hope that if they experience in their home and in their church and with their friends authentic worship, that's a lifestyle of worship, we can see great things. There is a remnant among the millennials that are hungry for the things of God. What do you think about that?
Well, I think exactly. That's one of the things about millennials and Gen Z. I think we know more about millennials than we do the Gen Z, the younger ones. But in general, they really do want the truth. They're sensitive to disconnects from the truth, and they want things to be connected, which is another one of those pillars of trust, is having a legitimate connection that's positioned properly. And so they want to know how these things work. And I would suspect that if we could quiz them, they would want to know how that connects to their life right now. And so I think that what church or churches will that find a fruitful grounding in? Because if it's a church where worship isn't a daily thing, this wasn't an authorized Bible study for their church. Yeah. They did this on their own, which is totally great. But what if church life in place X, Y, or Z is just that Sunday experience, and then there's nothing? So you have some exceptional teenagers who they're like, this is a way of life. They just met on Zoom. They're going to live together, so they have a devotion. That's fantastic. That's exactly the culture that will preserve the church in the future.
Amen.
And so just discerning, I guess, whether they know it or not, they know what church culture needs to be, with or without buildings, with or without organizations. I would suspect that they just did a 21st century version of Acts 2.
Yeah. Amen. There's hope. And we're going to dive deeper into that idea of reaching the millennials in our next Zoom call, which will be part 3 of our series. So, Dr. Van Gilder, any last words before I close?
Oh, well, you don't want to get me started. I'll go too long. So, no, that's a perfect story to end with. That's just awesome. The future of the church is sitting in hands like that. So that's awesome.
Yeah. Amen. Well, thank you so much for your time. We're going to look forward to part 3 of this series, Reaching Millennials. God bless you, brother.
All right. Thank you.
We'll talk to you later.